Welcome to the fifth episode of the Sydney Contrarian, titled Malcolm Turnbull, the most effective Conservative Australian Prime Minister. This is my first episode on political views, and as such, I'm likely to say some things that may not come across as being fully correct. I appreciate any corrections or clarifications from my listeners. At the time of recording this video, the current Prime Minister in Australia is Malcolm Turnbull, who holds progressive political views but is leading a traditionally conservative party. Mr. Turnbull is experiencing significant challenges in his leadership. He barely clung to a majority government in the election last July, losing a substantial number of seats that his predecessor, Mr. Tony Abbott, had won in the 2013 election. And just on Wednesday, a maverick Conservative Senate member, Cory Bernardi, announced he would split from the coalition and start his own Australian Conservatives Party. This may just be the beginning of the end to the Turnbull Coalition Party, as Conservatives within the party are fed up by his sabotage of core party values and also slumping poll results. As a Conservative, I find it quite amusing to see how Mr. Turnbull has been dealt a good slap in the face over the past 15 months of his prime ministership, since it is quite ironic that when Mr. Turnbull ousted Mr. Abbott from the top job, he has cited that he was driven by the dismal polls of his predecessor. He thought he took one for the team, and then ended up almost being taken out himself. Talk about poetic justice. Oh, and there's more on this, which I'll cover later on in this video. Let me quickly start by defining what is a conservative and what is a progressive. A conservative typically adheres to principles of personal responsibility, moral values, limited government, and agrees with pretty much George Washington's farewell address that religion and morality are indispensable supports to political prosperity. A progressive, also called a liberal, but not to be confused with the Liberal Party, advocates the freedom of the individual, parliamentary systems of government, non-violent modification of political, social, or economic institutions to ensure unrestricted development in all spheres of human endeavour, and government guarantees of individual rights and civil liberties. But in more recent times, liberals have somewhat abandoned freedom of individuals and headed towards collectivism, and similarly, their non-violent approaches to modifying society has given way to more coercive, subversive, and violent means. In the Australian political arena, the two major parties traditionally align themselves relatively well with these two definitions. The coalition party, comprising the Liberals and the National Party, traditionally represented the Conservatives, being more supportive of a free market, having some nationalistic views and services, and they believe that the services of a country are more to be provided by private sectors than the government. The Australian Labor Party traditionally represented the working class, comprising mainly of union members. They are more progressive, supporting a more regulated market, a more open society to multiculturalism, government welfare, and a centrally planned economy. However, these days, the lines of conservatism and progressivism have blurred as a result of parties having to strike deals with minority parties that are more extreme on either ends, both the left and the right, and taking on their ideologies in order to remain in power. Such is the issue of compromise. And in the case of the coalition party, that's been actually altogether a transition towards more moderate progressive members who identify more with the Australian Labor Party than the coalition. And Mr. Turnbull is the leader of the pack. Mr. Turnbull and Mr. Abbott have quite a history of their own in terms of leadership challenges. In December 2009, Mr. Abbott successfully defeated Mr. Turnbull in a leadership challenge by one vote and retained the party leadership for almost 6 years afterwards. During this time, he also contested in 2 federal elections, winning at least 10 seats each time of the ALP government. In 2013, he became the 28th Prime Minister after soundly defeating Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. However, his popularity waned quickly after the election, and there began to be increasing doubts about his leadership position. The award of an Australian knighthood to Prince Philip in early 2014 left many in the public confused and somewhat in shock, and his proposed reinstatement of knights and dames in late 2014 damaged him further, especially when he retracted from his position. People were wondering exactly where he was heading, because his policies were just somewhat strange. Mr. Turnbull issued the first leadership spill in February 2015 but was soundly defeated 61 votes to 39. However, he issued a second leadership spill 7 months later in September 2015. Prior to the challenge, he fronted the press saying, "The one thing that is clear about our current situation is a trajectory. We have lost 30 news polls in a row. It is clear that the people have made up their mind about Mr. Abbott's leadership." Mr. Turnbull won this second leadership spill 54 votes to 44 and thus became the 29th Prime Minister of Australia. In taking on the leadership, the ABC reported that Mr. Turnbull said he would lead a thoroughly liberal government, committed to freedom, the individual and the market. I'm almost wondering whether when he said liberal government, whether that was capital L, which is a conservative government, or a small l, which is obviously a progressive government. And he also continued to say, "We need to have in this country, and we will have now, an economic vision, a leadership that explains the great challenges and opportunities that we face, that describes the way in which we can handle those challenges, seize those opportunities, and does so in a manner that the Australian people understand, so that we are seeking to persuade rather than seeking to lecture." He added, "The Australia of the future has to be a nation that is agile, that is innovative, that is creative. We can't be defensive. We can't future-proof ourselves. We have to recognize that the disruption that we see driven by technology, the volatility in change, is our friend if we are agile and smart enough to take advantage of it." Sounds very progressive, doesn't it? And the ABC further also said, "Mr. Turnbull held the top job in opposition but lost a ballot in 2009 to Mr. Abbott by 1 vote. He was ultimately brought down over his support for an emissions trading scheme. Some of his colleagues are wary of his return for his stance on climate change policy and support of same-sex marriage. Others believe he is their best chance of survival. As Communications Minister, he has reinvented the national broadband network and has been pivotal in serious internal debates on counter-terror laws." After taking on the job, Mr. Turnbull replaced the cabinet with predominantly moderate and progressive coalition ministers. The policy direction contrasted strongly with the traditional values of the coalition party, and many of its voters were disillusioned. On the issue of same-sex marriage, however, Mr. Turnbull went against his personal stance on supporting same-sex marriage and held on to the Abbott government policy of implementing a nationwide plebiscite should he retain the government in the upcoming election scheduled on the 2nd of July 2016. Let us look at the news poll two-party preferred polling results between 2013 and 2016 federal elections to understand to what extent Mr. Turnbull impacted on the party's prospects in winning the election, as that was a reason why he challenged Mr. Abbott for the leadership position. I had a look underneath the surface of this poll in terms of comparing how the polling results compare to actual election outcomes to assess its accuracy. What surprised me, or I guess I shouldn't, is that this poll is more likely to overstate the ALP and Greens votes, basically the more progressive parties, comprising more likely younger and technology-savvy individuals. So in interpreting these poll results, you might need to take a grain of salt in interpreting them and drawing conclusions, especially given the potential oversampling of or overrepresentation of progressive voters. However, aside from that, what is evident is that after Mr. Abbott's landslide victory over Mr. Rudd, the previous ALP Prime Minister, the coalition party began to slide in a two-party preferred vote. This bottomed out in mid-2014 after the 2014 budget was rejected by the ALP opposition. By early 2015, it was evident from these polls that the coalition party may face a significant defeat in the next election, which was due to be held within the next 18 months. Mr. Turnbull taking on the prime ministership led to a significant turnaround in the two-party preferred. So one could say that he did deliver on his initial assertions of helping the coalition party regain voter support. However, this was not to last. By February 2016, the honeymoon period was over, as it was evident that the Conservative voting bloc was angry at the betrayal of Mr. Turnbull on Mr. Abbott, and Mr. Turnbull's promises were all but unfulfilled as he met opposition from the ALP and the Greens every step of the way. As 2016 went on, the deadline loomed for Mr. Turnbull to call an election, and he faced a deadlock in the Senate on passing a bill to establish the Australian Building and Construction Commission to replace the Fair Work and Building Construction body. Believing that he could break the deadlock by basically putting the entire Senate to vote, he called a double dissolution election to be held on the 2nd of July. Now, a double dissolution election means that the House of Representatives and the entire Senate are dissolved. So all 226 members of Parliament are put on the vote. Normally, only the entire House of Representatives and half the Senate are dissolved. So this time, it was going to be a whole reshuffle. Now, the last time a double dissolution election was called was in the Bob Hawke government in 1987. Again, that election was brought forth in order to break a deadlock. So Mr. Turnbull was going to throw in the whole lot, believing that he had enough support from the Australian public to build a stronger parliament both in the lower house and the upper house in the Senate to pass his bills. Well, Mr. Turnbull's gamble was quite an embarrassment, as the election results show. In the 2013 federal election, Mr. Abbott secured 90 seats out of the 150 in the lower house and 33 seats out of 76 in the upper house. That was a strong majority, and even that majority in itself was not enough to get certain bills passed. By 2016, Mr. Turnbull lost 14 seats in the lower house and 3 in the upper house. So marginal was his victory that Mr. Turnbull could not declare it on election night. Or rather, it should also be said that the opposition leader, Mr. Bill Shorten, took 8 days to concede defeat, as postal votes arrived and it was clear that Mr. Turnbull would win a slim majority in the lower house. What is most interesting, though, is what happened in the Senate. The winners in this double dissolution election were the minority parties. Ironically, despite a bill being passed prior to the election that was going to disadvantage these parties from winning Senate seats, 2 more seats were won off the 2 major parties, and one was won off the Greens party, a left-wing progressive party. So the Greens returned with 9 seats. Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party, which is a right-leaning conservative nationalist party, made a stunning return into the political arena, winning 4 seats, while Nick Xenophon's left-leaning South Australia-based party won 3 seats. With an unprecedented significant crossbench, Mr. Turnbull would need to make concessions with the minority parties to pass any bills through the Senate. It was actually much harder than before the election. So talk about a backlash and a really bad call by Mr. Turnbull. Well done. After the July 2nd election, Mr. Turnbull faced a parliament that was much more deadlocked than before. For him, it was a bad thing, given he was a progressive. However, as the public knows his agenda and has been assessing him based on his ability to deliver his agenda, his poll results suffered. As we see in the news poll primary votes and two-party preferred, the coalition party saw further declines. In fact, this week we even saw the coalition party's primary votes fall below that of the ALP. Below that of the ALP, right? Where did these primary votes go? Not to the ALP, not to the Greens, but to the independent parties. In fact, I suspect part of the losses experienced by the coalition party on primary votes went to the more conservative-leaning minority parties, which may include Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party, and also possibly in a split to Cory Bernardi's newly formed Australian Conservative Party. And looking at the two-party preferred results, we see that the coalition party trailed behind the ALP at a level almost as bad as when Mr. Turnbull ousted Mr. Abbott from the party leadership. Let's have a look at exactly what has gone wrong. And on the 6th of February, There's an article on news.com.au titled, "Welcome to Supermarket Politics, BYO Trolley." Some of the more insightful comments in this article included, Australia and the two countries from whom we inherited our political system, the UK and the US, all evolved fairly organically into a two-party system, a sort of least worst approach that meant while voters were unlikely to be completely satisfied, they were also unlikely to be completely disappointed. Implicit in this compact is that only the major parties can deliver a holy trinity of good government. 1. Stability. Major mainstream parties can be relied upon to hold government and elevate the most competent to the top. Yeah, right, okay. Doesn't look like we've had very competent leaders in the past few years. But going on, credibility. Major mainstream parties have well-established policy positions and can be relied upon to consistently maintain them. Yeah, right. Have you looked at all those flip-flopping oppositions on same-sex marriage, on Medicare, and on the economy? They've been pretty terrible. Number 3 is security. Major mainstream parties are mature and centrist enough to present a united front on defense and foreign policy issues. Well, if they've changed leadership so many times, and there's always been some dummy spitting, with the exception of Mr. Abbott, after he got ousted by Mr. Turnbull, I'm not sure about the mature bit. And to present a united front on defense and foreign policy issues, well, give it to them. When a major party loses one of these trust factors, it is deeply wounded. Oh, hell yeah. In Australia, they have lost all three. Stability is obviously shredded. In the past decade, not a single Prime Minister has survived their first term. This is a farce and was once unheard of in modern Australian history. Credibility is likewise shot. For Labour, climate change went from being the greatest moral challenge of our lifetime to legislative backwaters. And in fact, nowadays, you've also have reports saying that climate change, a lot of the data is complete rubbish. And for Mr. Turnbull, it did the same as soon as he saw a chance to become PM. The Liberals' tax plans are a shambles, and Labour's Medi-Scare campaign was a complete disgrace. And both leaders have had more positions on gay marriage than a contortionist at a swingers club. Oh, you can say that one again. Labour, which crowed about its seats results in 2016, well, in fact, it received only 34.7% of the primary vote, a new record low. That was hardly something to write home about. The Liberals and Nationals combined received just over 42%, a drop of 3%, and only managed to scrape home by the thinnest possible margin. And they really only did it because the Greens took away the ALP vote. Since then, the coalition's primary vote has collapsed further, according to today's news poll, to a staggering 35%. And despite this immolation, well, Labour is stagnant on 36, a figure that is almost as damning. Almost 30% of people want to vote for neither of them, and I'm one of them too. Across the 4 elections in the past 10 years, minority party support went from 14.5% to 23%, and that is quite significant. So now I'm going to go back to why I titled this video Malcolm Turnbull, the most effective Australian Conservative Prime Minister. We've established that Mr. Turnbull is a progressive wolf among the pack of Conservatives, and I would stop to call them sheep because Conservatives are not sheep. Mr. Turnbull is clearly in the wrong party, and as are some of his key supporters, such as Mr. Christopher Pyne and Mr. George Brandis. These individuals stand by values that Conservatives do not, most prominently in same-sex marriage, more government spending, restricting religious freedom, opening our national borders, and towing the United Nations agenda on climate change. The fact that the current cabinet are dominated by these progressive members has angered coalition party traditional supporters and those in the backbench. There is a catch, however, and Mr. Turnbull is either unaware of it or he's playing a really dangerous trade-off. Mr. Turnbull can either satisfy his personal ego of being the Prime Minister of Australia, or he could sacrifice that to establish a legacy. But one thing is certain, he cannot have both. On the issue of legalizing same-sex marriage in Australia, to illustrate my point, Mr. Turnbull was forced by his party to promise holding a national plebiscite so the Australian public could vote on whether they support changing the Marriage Act. This was emphatically opposed by the ALP, the Greens, Nick Xenophon team, and Darren Hinch of the Australian Justice Party. So the bill to hold the plebiscite passed the lower house due to the coalition party holding a slim majority, but it will be knocked down by the Senate where the majority wants a conscience vote. However, the lower house would not be able to support a conscience vote, as Mr. Turnbull's slim majority will immediately disappear as long as at least 2 coalition members choose to split from the coalition party. And there are enough Conservative coalition MPs who have indicated publicly that they would do just that. Thus, poor Mr. Turnbull, being a strong supporter of redefining marriage, is hamstrung on getting through what he would like. Conservatives in Australia, among many, should be glad about this. Should a Conservative coalition win a more significant majority in the lower house and the Senate in the election, Australians may actually have to risk a plebiscite favouring those who support changing the definition of marriage. And at present, polls do suggest that supporters of same-sex marriage may actually win that plebiscite, thanks to a strong marketing campaign and the media obviously fanning the flames behind it. Further, the media has been critical and even militantly scathing of conservative values, having virtually sold themselves to cultural Marxist rhetoric and political correctness in recent years. At present, where the progressive agenda does not get pushed, the media would launch a barrage of attacks against so-called right-wing conservatives, bigots, homophobes, racists, Islamophobes, all the phobes and all the name-calling. They'll blame these people for preventing such a change. But Mr. Turnbull is caught in this barrage, even though he's one of the people on the media side. So having Mr. Turnbull take the helm and steering the ship, he's taking one for the Conservative team. If we actually had Mr. Abbott or a Conservative Prime Minister at the helm, the venomous attacks would be more pronounced and there could actually spark public protests, and it's really hard for a Conservative Prime Minister to hide. However, Mr. Turnbull, the media has to temper the attack, otherwise they're going to rack up some friendly fire. So from what I see, the period leading up to the next election will be filled with inertia, and this will frustrate the progressives. But it also provides some hope and amusement for the Conservatives. Given this current climate, Conservatives may rather that the government does not make much changes to the status quo, especially on social issues and border security. However, there needs to be more focus on dealing with the economy, and government spending should be reined in to deal with that deficit. And progressives do have a really bad track record on reining in spending, as they believe the government is a solution to almost every problem. And if there isn't a problem, the government can always create some problem. So finally, I'm going to conclude and talk a bit about Malcolm Turnbull from a Christian perspective. I see Mr. Turnbull as a bit of a reverse King Cyrus in Australia. Now, some of you may know that God our Father can appoint whom he chooses to do his will. In the case of King Cyrus in the Bible, God our Father appointed this king to allow the Israelites to return to Jerusalem, which was utterly destroyed 70 years prior, so that they can rebuild the temple. In a similar fashion, I believe that enough Australians prayed to our Father God to protect Australia in the recent time from the progressives and cultural Marxists. And he in turn delivered us Mr. Turnbull's minority government that would be able to keep things as they are for the next 3 years. With many social changes that other countries have pushed and Australia is kind of behind, we may well be able to breathe just a little bit easier, but it doesn't mean that we should stop praying. So those who are of his kingdom, continue to pray for a stay in rebelling against our Father God. I leave you with this Bible passage from Psalms chapter 2, verses 2 to 4. The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, Let us break their bands asunder, and cast away their cords from us. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall have them in derision. Then shall he speak unto them in his wrath, and vex them in his sore pleasure. Well, that's it from the Sydney Contrarian. Stay tuned for a future episode. Once again, God bless.